Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson. I'm joined today by a man who was maybe on episode 6, episode 5 of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, and now it's episode 237. Um,
Wow.
yeah, obviously along the way, I kind of transitioned a little bit more to co-hosting the Weightlifting House podcast, and we had you on there more than a handful of times and had a lot of great discussions. And discussions that were much needed as like an up and coming coach who's trying to figure all of this out and navigate this like place of constant streams of information. I mean that agnostically, it's just information, and you're trying to sort and sift and understand how it's relevant or applies or doesn't. And I feel like our conversations were a great kind of like great action step in making a difference in my coaching and how I thought about it, how I programmed, and so thank you for that. And also, hopefully, if people aren't familiar, or they are, they can welcome you to the podcast with me, Quinn Hench.
Joshua, thanks for having me on again. It's pretty cool to come full circle to the show since it's been I don't even know 6 or 7 years, maybe
Yeah,
something at
that's right.
least. And it's been pretty amazing to watch your growth and to see all the different things that you've done, and yeah, the conversations that we've had have been some of my favorite. So it takes two, you know. So hopefully we can have another one.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, on top of that, the one thing about you specifically, and a lot of the people who I found are like recurrent guests on podcasts and kind of public facing or forward facing, is that you guys are always willing to hop on a call with someone, have a conversation to help out, to provide some information or context or experience to someone who wants to know more. And I see that just from like the coaching side, but I also know you do that from the side of the clinician as well. So clinicians who are looking for help or looking for direction, you're always more than willing to provide whatever help you can. Um, because when I started the podcast, right, it was like 3 people listened, now however many, but like way back, there's no incentive to do that. So you went out of your way to help, and I think that that's a large reason why the podcast gained traction in the first place. So the fact we're able to have this conversation is largely because people like you are willing. Um, why do you think that is? Why are we so willing to just kind of anyone who reaches out, hop on a call, hop on a conversation, and kind of help them out?
Well, people did it for me, and I had and still do have transformative experiences from the people who are willing to have those conversations. And I know what that feels like, and I know how appreciative and important it was for me, and still is. And so I try to pay that forward anytime that I can. And these conversations are helpful for me as well. You and I especially, you ask great questions and we have great dialogue, and it helps me to organize my thoughts too. So it's not just a one-way street in terms of who this type of thing benefits. So um, I I guess I even don't even understand not being willing to have conversations, and to hash some things out. So I think it's helpful for everybody, and I think hopefully people will be willing to continue to do that and to find time for the up and coming. Because plus, you never know, like, now you're inviting me to speak at these amazing events that you're a part of, and you never know, like, who would you be saying no to. And I'm not advocating, I'm not to say yes to everything, even when you don't have any bandwidth, but you just never know what type of opportunities and people that you meet, so you kind of always just keep those things in your mind, because it's pretty cool to think about where things have come, this many years.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely, and I think that's exactly what Max, Ada, and I are trying to do with the Coach Logic mentorship, and then the coaching platform we're going to eventually have. And one thing you've been able to do with Clinical Athlete and now Cal U is kind of provide that same more formalized place to help people who are interested in understanding more about their profession, right? And if we think of coaching more as a profession, or think of it more as a place where you can become a professional, I think it makes more sense to have different areas of pursuing development as a coach professionally, and that's like in the trenches. That's with the tactics and techniques, and with all the program design stuff and all the other coach related stuff that we could obviously dig into. And you mentioned Coaches Only. I think that's a great way to kind of introduce the topic of the show. So Coaches Only is a speaking event that you'll be a part of, along with Zach Robinson, who was previously on the podcast, Olivia Reeves, Dr. Aaron Kunanen, Max Ada will be on there. There are plenty of people who are going to have Eric Helms. Great talk centered around almost individualizing the training process and better understanding how to program for an individual. I think there's kind of this like idea that, coaching is kind of this thing that you understand and you can do and you can apply it to a sport, but really you're applying it to an individual within a sport. So an individual who assumes certain constraints within the sport, certain movement constraints, and all the things that surround that dictate how they basically operate within the agreed upon rules and regulations. So for us, we're going to talk about that within the context of weightlifting. And Quinn, someone who's written extensively on movement assessment optimization, it kind of, I guess, in the realm you're in, it's really understanding the role of different forms of exercise to provide different like types of or forms of stress, I guess, or different like applications of stress. So maybe you can kind of lead into what you want to discuss at Coaches Only, how you've conceptualized it, and then we can kind of dig into more of the details.
Yeah, I think the idea of exercise selection is broadly what I'll be covering. And, within the sphere of weightlifting, obviously, but I think the principles could probably be applied pretty broadly. And exercise selection is like a lot of things with exercise prescription and training. It's simple in concept, but not easy in application because of what you alluded to. We're dealing with complex systems that aren't textbook and rarely behave in this linear, completely predictable fashion. And so, if we just take weightlifting and do go to the extremes and say, well, the sport is a snatch and clean and jerk. So we start there. Well, why doesn't everybody only do singles on the snatch and singles in the clean and jerk and call it done? It's the same reason why in literally every other sport that they don't only do the exact full movements or scrimmaging, if it's a team sport, of the sport, because you don't necessarily get exposed. You can work on the skill itself to a certain degree, but that doesn't necessarily give you a lot of exposure to anything else that's specific. And the body will learn how to self-organize itself to get the task done within its current capability. But if it runs into any ceiling, then that's going to be the limiting factor. So the idea of rate limiters or bottlenecks in the system is really what drives exercise selection. And people may not use those terms in their mental model, but that's what we do. Like, why do we program back squats for a weightlifter? Well, back squat's not their competitive sport, competitive movement. So why are we doing that? Well, we want to put more weight on their frame, and we want their legs to have to move and produce tremendous amounts of force, even more than potentially what they have to do during a snatch and a clean and jerk, so that they have a greater potential, given the same skill, to be able to perform with more output during the competitive movements. And so we're hoping for some dynamic correspondence there. It's the same reason why would we do a tall snatch or a snatch balance for somebody who's scared to get under the bar. Well, with the snatch, there's a lot of other moving parts that they have to worry about. Before they worry about getting under the bar, they have to pull that bar off the floor and they have to fixate it over their head. And there's so many other things. There's a lot of limiting factors that could potentially get in the way if I'm just trying to work on having this person get under the bar. So I say, okay, let me constrain this task in a way that allows us to work on the bottleneck more directly. And we could go down the line and provide a myriad of examples in that way. But I think that's the frame of reference, is when the organism doesn't adapt in the exact way that we think it's going to adapt, or it's a little slower, then we have to figure out ways to identify the rate limiters and address the rate limiters and keep the person engaged. And that is, that's exercise selection kind of in a nutshell. So I think it's a complex process within a simple, general umbrella, but I think there's a lot there to be able to discuss and to help people.
Yeah, and I think you made a great point kind of at the end to round it off. It's like people who also carry out this training. So it's this idea of like, yeah, you have all these kind of mechanical tools, but then someone has to actually do it, and they have to they get to experience it, and then they're like, okay, what is this thing that's happening? Am I able to enjoy it or feel like it's something that I want to engage in or invest in and do over the long term? Because again, even if in a perfect world it was really about specificity and just like it was purely mechanically driven, from like a physiological perspective, but the person absolutely hated that approach. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't really matter, and that obviates the usefulness of that approach. So if we can make it more interesting or more novel, and actually something interesting, Max and I have talked about a lot, and one thing he did with the programs he would write me is there was no very obvious pattern. There's no obviously like predictable pattern. And he knows it as, here's the phase of the lift we need to target or correct. Here are the exercises we want to use, but they would be manipulated in a way and across time that nothing really ever repeated. So you kind of go into the weight room and you don't really know what to expect with performance because you're doing something entirely different. Is that a measuring cup?
Yeah.
It took me off guard for a second. Which speak of unpredictability.
Well, I figure because I heat up the water, it's coffee. We're talking about coffee, so I just drank from a measuring cup, and that's what Josh said. Because I use the measuring cup to like measure out the water and stuff, and I'm like, well, why do I then pour it into a mug and have two dirty things? Yeah. So I just drink out of the measuring cup. It's a great mug. It's got a handle. It's big. It's insulated. It's big and thick. So there it is. Work harder, work smarter, not harder.
And then that's why you're so successful. Is no other person would think to drink out of the measuring cup. But I mean, speaking of that, right? With training, you have that sense of unpredictability. You have a pattern that isn't able to be picked up on as readily. So you go into the weight room, you do some sort of like low hang, no feet clean. The next day do, pause below knee clean. And they're all somewhat similarly related. And like weightlifting is not that varied, but it's so novel that you don't know what to expect, but in the best way possible of, I have to do 80% almost every session or 85% almost every session, but I'm also able to do that every session. So from like a movement standpoint, I noticed when I did that for extended periods, my movement was probably the best it's ever been, at least in the clean. Like my clean just dialed in, and I look back at it and it's like, wow, I don't know if I ever thought I'd move that well. It's a little harder to find peak performance, in my opinion, when you do something like that. It's just a little less predictable. It doesn't quite have that crescendo that it would build to. But from an enjoyment perspective, it was always a nice break. Whereas I've done programs and, you do things where it's like, the same day will repeat within a week. So it's not only does it repeat from week to week, but you'll get the same day repeating within a week.
Mm.
So you'll do a certain type of session on day one. You'll do the same session on day two, or the same session on day 3 or 4. So you're getting multiple exposures. So then instead of just seeing that exercise, that session of exercises from first week, second week, third week, fourth week, you're seeing it 1 to 4 times within a week. And I found that just creates a little bit more. I'm not using this in like the technical sense of like sports science, but more monotony.
Yeah.
So I think exercise selection is a huge part of the enjoyment piece, but also just the engagement piece.
Okay. So there's a lot there, and there's a lot of great stuff there. And it can, so none of this stuff has to be dichotomous. Like it's not, I don't think we're advocating one approach over the other. I think it's the coach and athlete dynamic will kind of dictate what phase we're in, what are the goals, and when to use what, because enjoyment can come in many forms. Enjoyment can also come in the form of, well, like training sucks because it's really hard and it's really boring and monotonous, but it's enjoyable because we know where we're headed, we're seeing progress, and we're gearing up for a meet. And that, like, it's not, I don't care if it's boring because it's like that's not even on the mind of the athlete. If we're gearing up to a meet, it's understood that we're going to be doing a lot of the same things, and it's not going to be easy. And so your mind almost goes beyond that, and the enjoyment is the overall process, thinking about where we need to be. But that's not always the case, and that's not forever. And that's why there are phases, whether we're using block periodization or whether we're not. Training looks different. Things change from month to month, week to week, year to year, depending on the goals, depending on the athlete's situation. So sometimes enjoyment comes out literally from the training itself, and like, oh, that was a really fun variation. Like you've experienced this as a lifter, I'm sure. I've experienced it as a coach where I program something like a dipless, like a power clean plus dipless jerk, where they power clean and they receive the power clean in that quarter squat position, but then they go drive right into a jerk or a push press. It's kind of fun. It's like a power clean thruster. And they're like, that was really fun. That was a fun thing to do. It was new and novel, and that was cool. But that's not going to drive. I'm not going to then say, okay, well, that's then our new clean and jerk variation if they're a competitor, because obviously they need to dip and drive, and there's a skill element to the regular clean and jerk. So I think a seasoned coach has this menu of options that they pick from, and the menu expands or it shrinks depending on the goal, the current goals, and what direction they're heading in the short to medium. And there's a lot of, to the point that you made earlier, weightlifting is not that varied. Like you're going to be doing things that look generally like snatching and look generally like clean jerks and look generally like barbell squats and like pulls. That if you want to do jumps, that's cool. That's all good. But it's not like you're going to be doing a lot. You're not going to be going out and running 10 miles and riding a bike and swimming. They're going to be looking like these movements. And so, yeah, no foot, no hook, clean and jerk or power jerk or something might like seem very different from a weightlifting perspective, but from like just a stress perspective, it's really similar. The point that you made, though, about getting in peak condition is that it's different enough that it probably isn't going to give you the absolute best performance on the very specific thing because it has that much of a difference. And so, well, nobody's saying that it is. You would just do more of the specific thing when it's time to do that. But then when it's not time, do you have have you expanded your training menu as a coach to understand, one, I can just program variations to keep things fresh mentally, but also like no hook, no feet snatches, you might have a very specific reason to do that. If you've noticed that your athlete donkey kicks or bangs the bar away from them, like they have a really aggressive, violent extension on their pull, but the trajectory is such that they create a lot of space between the bar and the body, and they bang their hips horizontally into the bar. It creates a lot of distance and space between the bar and the body. And you're like, well, I've been banging my head against the wall, like cueing them not to do that. Keep the bar close, stay over the bar, keep your feet on the ground longer, like all of these things that make sense from an observation standpoint, but that doesn't necessarily mean the person internalizes that verbal cue and then can do it the way that you want to. So what do? You put constraints around the movement. You say, okay, do whatever you have to do, but you have to keep your feet on the platform. You have to keep your feet on the platform. That's my one rule. I don't care. Get this clean done. Keep your feet on the platform. And so as long as they adhere to that one rule where they can't donkey kick because they adhered to that constraint, or no hook, it's really hard to complete a lift with no hook grip if you bang the bar with your hips and bang it away from you, because the bar is going to fly out of your hands. So the beauty of a no hook lift is that what you'll see is the person just organize themselves in a way where they can hold on to the bar. And what you'll see is their pull gets a little smoother. It tends to get a little bit more vertical, and it quote unquote fixes, or it would punish the problem if they stayed with their own pattern or stayed with their old pattern and maintain that constraint. So exercise selection is you're kind of managing this. How specific do we need to be right now? What are the current goals? What am I trying to address with this exercise selection? And how many options are there to do this? And there's usually a lot. The idea of a training menu is such that there's usually a lot of different options that will provide the same outcome. And you kind of just have to try things that resonate, like keeping the bar close. Well, some coaches will be like, well, I like to program like halting deadlift plus lift, which is way different than a no hook clean. Halting clean deadlift plus clean. Well, I program no hook cleans. What's the goal of both? Well, to keep the bar close. Halting deadlift, the hypothesis, well, if I stay over the bar longer, my hips will meet the bar more kind of right over the middle of the foot, and we'll be able to send the bar directly upward. So it's like we're meeting the same end, and the outcome and the goal of the exercise selection was the same, but two different variations. And there's a lot of things like that especially in non-weightlifting S&C, where like if you're just like, I just want to build muscle, or I want to create like lower body concentric propulsive strength, literally every lower body exercise you want to do, and then we can argue till our heads are blue about, what's more specific, what's going to provide more transfer. But it's the same in weightlifting. So I think the idea is not to get too caught up in the specificity trap, because everything is in fact non-specific unless it's a weightlifting meet. Even a single and a snatch and clean and jerk. Are you on somebody else's clock? No, probably not. You're probably resting like you want to. You're lifting during the time of the day that you decided. So like there's no judges, or there's no officials in front of you. There's no crowd. So there's so many other contextual factors that aren't the actual specific event. So just get it out of your mind right away that what you do is 100% specific, because it's guaranteed not to be right off the bat. And now everything beyond that is just a little bit of a gradient in the other direction. But deciding what phase we're in, what success means right now, and does that literally just mean variation for the sake of variation, to keep things fresh, to keep this person coming to the gym, and so that they can not lose their gains while they kind of mentally decompress and recharge a little bit? That's fantastic. That's great. And just throw all the variations that you want at them. Does success right now mean peak performance? And we're not actually worried if they're enjoying training, because that's not the goal right now. The goal is something bigger. The goal is a performance at a particular date in a particular moment. And then enjoyment comes from the outcome, or at least, the process itself. And or are we trying to address something very specific? Whereas I might program that no hook, no foot clean just for the sake of variation, but I also might program it specifically to address a rate limiting technical aspect of their sport. And it's not always technique. We go back to the squats. It could be just physiological output. That's probably a little bit more simple in terms of what we decide, just progressive loading. But I think that right there is a framework that's super useful. Again, challenging to apply, but it's getting your reps in as a coach, and also I think paying attention to what you're doing and keeping record is very helpful as well for us, for each athlete, and just generally, like what works, what seems to resonate with this athlete, what do they respond well to, both from an specific exercise standpoint, but also just from a planning standpoint. Like you mentioned, you responded really well to these microcycles that were like varied, and you had all of this. Maybe you were developing lots of movement options and you were getting comfortable. There was nothing that was going to make you uncomfortable from a clean and jerk standpoint, because you had been exposed to it all with these different variations, and you responded well to that. And there were a certain time where you didn't respond very well to being hyper specific, and so like doing the same workout multiple times in even a week, not just like you said, like not just a repeating microcycle, but like within the week. I do that when the goal is to reduce the noise. And in an injury scenario, tons of variation can be helpful to keep the person engaged, not create repetitive stress, but it also doesn't really provide you with any real clue as to how things are progressing. So if somebody's got I'm a physio, so if somebody's got something going on, pain with a certain movement pattern, some type of an acute injury, something that I actually expect, especially to behave linearly, like if it is acute, I expect this to go away. I don't know how long it's going to take, but if I give you the same workout multiple times within a microcycle, that is itself a measuring stick, because it's going to give me an idea of how volatile the symptoms are. We're comparing apples to apples, essentially, or we're doing our best. So there are specific scenarios where I think that's super valuable, and whether it's enjoyable or not to you is not something that I don't care about, but it's less of a concern. And as long as I communicate the why behind what we're doing, 100% of the time, the person is on board. Like, I've never had a scenario where I say, okay, like, this is not necessarily the most fun thing that we're going to do, but you're injured right now anyway. So it's not like you're going to be in peak performance no matter what we do. You're going to see this workout coming up, or you're going to see this particular movement coming up quite frequently within the next couple of weeks. And I'm doing that so that we can use it as kind of a measuring stick and a checkpoint to gauge how things are progressing. And it's going to give me an idea of patterns, and they understand that concept, but we don't do it forever. And so I think that's the big point here, is kind of like considering context.
Yeah, I think what you perfectly did was, one, you gave a great introduction to the talk you'll give, and how complete it will be, and also like what it will span. But also, I think you provided a lot of evidence, in my opinion, for how complex coaching can be. And
Yeah.
complex in the sense of there are just a lot of layers, and generally they're layers of abstraction. You could, because you made a few points about like, these things are arbitrarily constrained, and we're doing our best approximation of like how to improve them. So unless you do the thing, you're one step removed, and you're just it's a best guess of like, okay, we constructed a plan that's attempting to have these effects, to create these adaptations, to create this performance change across time. But again, it's a best guess. It's an approximation, right? It's taking all of your theory and all of your experience and everything you have and applying it on paper in this form of like mechanical loading, and having the person process it and then seeing what the outcome is. So it's pretty abstract, and then we're also playing with different time scales, which just
Mm.
by the nature of it makes it difficult because for people, and I'd say for organisms, animals, whoever you want to talk about, whatever you want to talk about, it's like the immediate moment is the thing. I need to do the best to provide for myself in the immediate moment, and
Yeah.
tomorrow doesn't really matter. The day after matters less. The day after that matters less. And like the further down the chain you get, or the further down the calendar or timeline you get, like the less you can really say like this is the point that matters. If you have a competition, that's a little different, but you're still trying to optimize performance in the moment. And it's not optimized as in like I need to be in peak shape to hit a 1 RM PR, but it's I need to be able to perform in a way that's going to provide the stimulus that creates the adaptation, that creates like more performance potential across time. So even when you're optimizing for a future date, you're always optimizing for the current session. And maybe that means like, well, if this session's lighter and easier and more technical, we can optimize or potentiate the next session and have a better performance or a bigger output, which maybe creates, theoretically creates a better adaptation. So you have all these layers of abstraction, and then you have these timelines that make it like far more complicated and difficult. Um, so coaching isn't simple. I mean, I think that's what we try to get across in the podcast, but just in our information and content in general, is that it's complicated, and it should be approached in a way where it's taken seriously, but also treated seriously. So you mentioned, I think we could probably both go on about how like language can create a lot of confusion in both of our professions from like
Mm.
a practice standpoint, but a coaching practice standpoint. Because if we want to talk about long-term planning and periodization, and you kind of mentioned block periodization, it's like I don't know if everyone does block periodization technically by the book, but like we all periodize training. So like any
Yeah.
confusion around that is, I think, more chalked up to the way we discuss it. But like this long-term plan that sequences training over time in a logical way, I think we all attempt to do that, and we can do it with different variables and manipulate durations. We can manipulate times. We can manipulate exercises, sets, reps, really anything. But there's like a strategic change over time, and it follows a mostly traditional pattern of more extensive to more intensive, more volume to less volume, and maybe there's a lot of nuance, but I think we all periodize training and we all have some sort of like phasic structure somewhat. Given that we have mesocycles or blocks that are kind of stacked together logically again to lead to a performance change at the end of it, and during it, but like on the competition platform. So we have like layers of abstraction, timelines, and then we have the confusion around the language used. So it can be really messy. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, where were a lot of your influences from, or who are a lot of the people who influence the way you think about this stuff? So when you talk about, and I've heard it a lot because I've probably consumed almost every hour of content you've ever created. Um, Kind of joking. But when you talk about complex systems, like that's kind of derived, I think, more generally from the scientific literature. I know in a lot of fields they talk about complex systems or dynamic systems, and which is interesting. I never thought it was so far-reaching, but this idea of like complex systems, creating noise, creating like feedback, and then providing change or adaptations off of that feedback. So I've heard you talk about that stuff. Who are a lot of the influences that led to the way you tend to think currently about programming and exercise selection?
Oh man. um Gosh, there's so many. I think it's like people who have even just mentioned some of these concepts like complex systems and complexity science is a whole field. Like dynamical systems theory is a whole mathematical model of you're studying change.
Mm.
So when you, it's funny because when we think of, oh, I didn't realize like that these apply to so many things and that these concepts were so wide reaching. Well, like they actually apply to everything.
Mm.
Everything in our world is a complex system, meaning there are multiple moving parts. The parts sum to something, to a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts, and that whole serves some type of purpose. So we can go up and down the line of different examples of complex systems in the world, weather, traffic, cities, any relationship, your body,
Mm.
a biological complex system that's self-organized. Try to explain us having this conversation, our consciousness, and how we do things by just talking about a single system or a type of cell. No, it's all working in concert, and a program is the same. So we already have this biological complex system of the person. Now we're trying to create, provide inputs to drive some type of response. So now we're injecting ourselves into their system and trying to derive a certain behavior. We're a complex system ourselves. Like you said, everything is unpredictable. We're all just we're basing this on just kind of rough probabilities that we predict that if we do these things enough, that we'll have the system will behave in this way. It'll adapt in this way. So I don't even know if I can point to a single person. It was many influences kind of nudging me towards thinking greater than this linear in a linear predictable way, and then people introducing me to, like, here's a paper on complex systems in healthcare, here's a paper on complex systems in economics, but here's how it relates to how you're trying to manipulate variables in your program. And it was like these little bits and pieces, and it just started to be something that then started to apply with my education
Mm.
with my athletes, because everybody will poo poo. It's like, okay, you're making this too complex. Training is not this complex when you're talking about all of these things, and it's a cop out to say that things are nonlinear and complex. Training is not that hard. Just do the thing and you get better at the thing. That's great, fine. People say that until they have an injury, until their person has a setback, until things don't go as planned, and then it's like, well, I don't know what happened. Must have been the programmer. It must have been them. So all of these things don't matter until something doesn't go as planned, which is usually at some point 100% of the time. So this has been my attempt to figure out why. Not even why. Sometimes the reason is literally the why stops at because we're a complex, unpredictable system. Like, I don't have the resources to be able to answer the question of why this happened beyond that. Why did Dre Greenlaw tear his Achilles hopping up and down on the sideline 2 days ago during the Super Bowl? Literally just running onto the field, tore his Achilles. I have no idea.
Mm.
And that is an extreme example. Why does a person feel like shit on this training day when they felt fine and everything else seems to be going well? No idea. Because we're a complex biological system and they are in some phase state with all interacting factors of their life coming together that has resulted in this moment, their performance output being low. But we also know that the upswing is coming, because that's what happens. So you brought up like us as humans we're always like in the now, in the now, in the now, in the now. I think a big thing about coaching is communicating something that you have communicated 100 times in the past, and that you're going to communicate 100,000 times more in the future, and saying it like it's the first time every time, because we're going to intuitively, the athlete knows process. One training day doesn't make or break us, but in the moment it feels like it does.
Yeah.
So when we're 3.5 weeks out from a meet and we have a really shitty training session, immediately the athlete's brain is going to go to, well, if I can't do these 90% lifts now, if I'm getting crushed by this now, how am I ever even going to be able to hit my openers and step on the platform in 3.5 weeks? When we know as coaches, and they know too, if they've had any experience in weightlifting, that there's a whole lot of change that can happen in 3.5 weeks. And in fact, with a lot of programs, you're probably in like the tail end of getting your ass kicked at 3.5 weeks before the meet. So you're actually probably right where you should be if we're looking at it from like kind of an overreaching model. But so my point, my answer to your question was, it was less about a specific person. It was multiple people and influences in my life, but more of what I was like, the questions that I had with physio and with coaching and training and training myself, and just seeing how learning the rules, quote unquote, was a great starting point. But the rules they're not actually rules, because the system doesn't behave the way that the rules say that it should all the time. And so why is that? I needed a model that at least explained that that is actually normal for those unpredictable fluctuations to happen. And then that's where I started to dig into some of this complexity science, decision theory, which is essentially making decisions with incomplete information, based on probabilities, which is everything that we do in life. And it's been helpful, I think. I think it's been helpful. My programs look different than they did 10 years ago, but I don't know if it's because of that. Like if it was just an outsider that was just looking at programs, I think that's just natural. I just have more bandwidth as a coach. I have more on my training menu. I have more in my repertoire as options and methods and all of these things. And I think maybe I have a grasp on the principles that I'm trying to go after. And that's maybe why my programs look different, the way that most coaches would evolve in 10 years, no matter what. But I think what it has actually done is helped with my explanations of the why and what we're doing, helped with the education and communication with the athlete, and navigating the ups and downs, and how I explain the ups and downs. I have this kind of fallback of like, this is okay. Like we've been here before. We know that there's ups and downs on the daily basis. If we zoom out, look at the trends, and just like simple things like that I may have been less comfortable with, and I may have had more panic with, if I didn't understand that we were dealing with these unpredictable systems in the first place. I'd be always looking for an answer, because I would think that that's what the person wants. And sometimes they do, but sometimes the answer is like, don't worry about it, because there's no way for us to answer this. Like, you had a shitty day, you had a shitty week, like that we are not going to have to be able to figure this out. Exactly why? Because there is no one reason. This is natural fluctuation. It's going to happen. Let's keep rolling. We've been here before. Whereas before it might have been, well, maybe it's this exercise, or we'll change this, or we'll tweak that. It was always like chasing things. And I think that's where it's really helped me just feel more comfortable.
I wonder too for you, and hopefully I don't veer this too off into philosophy, which ends up extending into other forms of like rigorous thinking, but this ability to like feel at ease with uncertainty or the unknowability of something. Do you feel like that's just extended kind of more broadly again, because the stopgap, like the thing that basically stops the bleed or stops the hemorrhage for people, is like a reason or some sort of answer, right? It's like, what's this problem? Oh, I just rationalize away 10 different things that like feel correct. So one I often come back to is this idea of like, oh, I'm in a calorie deficit, therefore my performance is going to suffer. When it does suffer, or when I have one of those off days, I'm in a calorie deficit. I mean, that's a probability point. You're making a probability, or you're trying to assess the probability of you being in an energy deficit and that being the reason why performance has changed negatively. Because if you made
Right.
progress, you wouldn't say, well, I'm in a calorie deficit, therefore I got better. So it's like trying to bridge that likelihood of something happening. What's the closest reason why that happened? I'll just use that as a way to stop the hemorrhage. And I think that like just interacting with people, and the more you think about or the more you read about and think about great thinkers, they always talk about like how much you know and how little you know, and they always come back to like trying to navigate uncertainty and navigate the complexity of what exists, and you find that like there are always these like open-ended, broad-reaching um, statements from them, or from great thinkers, at least in my experience. And when you see that day to day, it's often people trying to find reasons why, and the inability to just say like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I guess it's just what is today. Um, and I think sometimes when that happens, I'll fall back on it doesn't matter why, insofar as this was like our previous experience. So maybe you had a performance decrease, you didn't hit the lift you wanted to hit, you didn't have the day you quite wanted, but you just PR'd or tied your PR the other day, and the day before that you PR'd something else, you tied a PR on something else, and you've had this like previous history of doing really well. So this is just kind of like it's kind of like a scratch in the book, right? It's like when you're reading a 600-page book and there's a one letter typo in the middle somewhere. It's just like, oh, it's just kind of a blip, and it doesn't really mess with the book itself. It doesn't mess with the read of the book or the information in it. It's just a blip. Um, that's kind of the same way for training. If you've been training for 10 years, it's just like a small typo in the middle of it. Um, but do you think that, and what I'm, I guess, ultimately trying to get at is this way of thinking about uncertainty and complexity, and when you have a certain number of variables and they interact in unpredictable ways or unknowable ways, at least ways we can't define. Do you think that extends beyond just for you physio and for you training into other areas of kind of thinking about the way the world works?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's a rabbit hole. Um, but yes, very much so. And I'll keep it simple and say that it's helped me control and focus on the controllables,
Mm,
which are few, and it's helped me just be okay with and accept, not ignore and act like I don't have like feelings and think about things, but kind of come back to, okay, like what you just said, don't know why and or can't control it. What can I control? What are the rate limiters?
mm,
What's my next action to move forward? And that's, coming kind of full circle here. That's what the coach can help with exercise selection. By the way, exercise selection is like an active, it sounds active, like you're literally like picking and choosing and putting here and doing this and making changes. Sometimes it's not making a change. Actually, a lot of times it's not making a change. And I would say the action that I take most often is no action. There's it chasing every little fluctuation in a person's status and readiness and performance would there would never be a program that would last more than 3 days, because you would constantly be making iterations to try to chase. You'd always be behind the system anyway, because in a complex system there are delays in the the adaptation that occurs. There's delays in the person telling you how they feel.
mm.
And especially if you're a remote coach looking back on the week, like maybe they had a really shitty first half of the week and you're like, oh, I'm going to make a change for next week. But then by the end of that shitty first half, they felt great by the end. So what are you modifying? Point being, sometimes you need to just let time create patterns by just letting the person go through what was already planned, allowing these fluctuations to happen, because they're not bad. It's actually information, because you'll be able to identify patterns, and you'll figure out a lot about the athlete, what they respond to, by simply having them go through the thing and observing. Now it's going to come with what you just said, kind of like giving them the reassurance and the education that this is normal. But I think that people also have, people aren't stupid. They have common sense. If you just ask them straight up, do you think that people just PR every time they come to the gym? They're going to say no, obviously not. But that's how they're okay. And so I'll follow up with like, okay, but that's like how you're behaving right now. Like you pretend, like you just said, you gave the example, you just PR'd 3 days ago. Do you literally expect a PR? You don't think there's going to be a cost to that?
Mm.
Like that was a peak. Your body can't, that's not going to sustain and hold forever. Every time you come to the gym, then why hasn't somebody snatched 1,000 kilos if it's just every time you come to the gym you hit more? Like, yeah, I get it. Okay, so they know this intuitively, like it's common sense, but you just have to kind of like send that reminder every now and then. And then if you're going to switch up the exercises, or like what I'll do is I'll actually have days. A lot of my programs will look like, I don't know if let's say it's a 5-day week program, 4 or 5 day week program. There's a day or two that are going to stay the same from week to week. In order for what we talked about earlier, they're kind of like our checkpoint workouts. Not everything is standardized in the workout. It's not like every time and all your rest times, but it's like this workout is relatively the same from week to week. And the interesting thing that allows us to do is we look at that workout and see how that workout's progressing, and it kind of gives you a little insight into the adaptation of the cycle as a whole. Because throughout the week, the readiness is going to go up and down. But if you've got 5 or 6, and I'll run my microcycles for a while, it's kind of a Mike Tuchscherer emerging strategies approach to some degree, where that at least those 1 or 2 workouts will kind of look the same from week to week to week, and you can see like some fluctuations. But from week 1 to week 6 will give you a pretty good idea of how they responded to the session, to that entire block, and also at what point they started to reach diminishing returns. Because I'll see so many different combinations of ebbs and flows. But then the other days of that microcycle, things might vary a little bit more. Like Monday might be a snatch focused day, no matter what. On the entire block, Mondays, let's just say for this example, it's a snatch focused day, but the snatch variation will change based on what I saw from the previous week in terms of what I want to work on. It's like, oh, you were kind of pulling your shoulders back behind the bar a little early. This week, we're going to put some floating, halting snatch deadlift plus floating snatch to work on staying over the bar. Or though they were a little afraid to, like a hesitant to get under the bar last week. Monday's snatch variation is going to be snatch balance or heaving snatch balance or drop snatch or something like that. So there'll be a day that is like what you had described before, varied. And it's kind of based on immediate feedback from the week before. Then there's other days in the block that no matter what, I don't really care what happened. These workouts are going to stay the same, so that we can create a little bit of a signal there. And so everything's not so noisy. And that's not how every one of my program works, but that's kind of I would say a general structure that I will look to having is having kind of a checkpoint workout, and then being okay with being somewhat flexible with 1 or 2 other days, based on what I'm seeing previously. But I find if I change too much, I think it all actually depends on just make concessions and acknowledge the program. So if all 4 or 5 days are going to change like every week, just know that you're not going to gain a lot of pattern recognition from that. It's going to keep things fresh mentally, physically. But you're not going to glean a lot from that as a coach. So you just have to concede that. Like, it's not good or bad. I'm not saying that's the wrong choice. In context, it may be the right choice to keep the person coming into the gym. It's just not going to be all that informative going forward. You're not going to take that training block and be like, oh, we're going to put this in our back pocket because it worked really, really well for this athlete. It was just like exactly how it was structured because it's so varied. All you know is they liked variation and they had fun. That's really all you can take from it. Some athletes hate that, by the way. Because every time they have to like watch the video. I've never done this workout before. I've never done this exercise. I got to watch the video. You're not here. Maybe you are, but it's like every session they're like trying to learn something new.
Yeah.
And maybe they're just not into that. And they actually do like the predictability and the repeatability of having the same week repeat. They know what's coming. They don't have to think. They don't have to rewatch the video because they forgot what a drop snatch was or something like that. So it's, again, it's back to context and the athlete and what you're trying to do. But what we've talked about, I think the big picture here is there really is no right or wrong.
Right.
Because we've seen the best athletes at the biggest stage of the Olympics miss lifts. So nobody has this all the way figured out and predicted down to the science, or else we wouldn't have the competitions. We would just be able to predict who's going to win based on muscle cross-sectional area and, some other other tests like that. We would just like, oh, you have the potential, you will snatch the most because of these predictors. But no, we don't do that, obviously. So there's no right or wrong. Nobody's got this down to an exact science. Give yourself some leeway, create a training menu, identify your rate limiter. What's the bottleneck right now with this athlete? Sometimes the bottleneck's boredom. Sometimes it's something very specific, leg strength, or getting under the bar, or the first pull. What's the rate limiter? What's a training menu of options that I think will help to address this? Pick a couple and trial them for enough time. That's very arbitrary, enough time, but a number of weeks that allows you to see if the person's responding well to them or not. If so, you can always come back to it. If not, it still goes back into your training menu, because just because they responded or didn't respond to it now doesn't mean they won't or will in the future. So keep it around. But that's kind of the idea here, is don't be so caught up on like the fix, because there's probably multiple. And also just decide what you want, what you're okay with giving up in a program. If the program is highly varied, you're going to give up on pattern recognition and gleaning a lot of information for the future. Fine. If the program is super, super duper specific, you're probably going to give up some recovery cost and time on the back end, because you're going to need to like re-up a little bit. The athlete might feel a little beat up after that, but that's the point of that block. So you concede that, you communicate that, you set the expectations up from the beginning for both you and the athlete. And then that creates it's a freeing feeling when you've set it up that way, instead of just hoping to just say, all right, here's what we expect, here's what we will, or here's what we can and can't gain from this block, but here's why we're doing it. And we'll keep rolling. So I'll say to the person, like, everything is flexible to a point, but we'll try not to make a bunch of knee-jerk changes based on just the day-to-day. We want to wait and see if these are patterns that are holding, and then we can make modifications if need be. And people are generally on board. By week 3, they forget, they have a shitty training day, and the world's going to end. And then I just remind them, no, we had this conversation. Remember, we had this conversation. This day is exactly the conversation that we had 3 weeks ago about a day like this. Let's stay on it. Let's come back tomorrow, or tomorrow's a rest day. Let's see how you feel. We have options here. One option is to not change anything and just stay the course. That's generally my recommendation. And then typically they're just saying, yeah, I know, I just needed to vent, that type of thing. So it's complex, but actually knowing that is freeing to some extent.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of this is just, what is underrated is the way you use time, right? So the point of having like a big
Yes.
menu or a lot of options, right? So I went to a restaurant over the weekend, and they gave me two menus. Not only were they two menus, but they were massive. And one was breakfast, and
That's a
one was
lot.
like dinner and lunch, and they were like as as crammed with food as possible. The amount of time it would take to be able to experience or try every item, it'd take months and
Right.
months and months. Once you do that, you're at a place where you have 100 different options, right? So it's like, I'm kind of feeling this today, kind of feeling that. I know what to expect with this. I know what to expect with that. Whereas when you go somewhere with three items, it's like easy to try it all and know what you're getting, but you lose that variety and you lose the ability to accommodate like your interest or taste day to day. So maybe with two or three different menus of exercises, it's going to take more time to suss out the effect or potential effects of different exercises, different combinations. But if you can invest in the time of trying, invest in the time of experimenting with them, you have so many more options and such a better ability to create an outcome or potentially like gear someone towards a certain outcome. And the way I like to think about this with training too is like I use so many no contact variations now, like all the
Yeah.
time, extensively. And I remember I had a conversation with Don McCauley a long, long time ago. And I'd ask on the podcast, what's one exercise you hate or wouldn't use? And he said no contact variations. And I thought like, oh, that must be a bad lift. I won't use that. And I didn't use it for a really long time. And then I think like hearing Norik Vardanian talk about them, talking to Max about them, and then just like playing around with it, I'm like, oh, this really helps correct a lot of problems that people generally have. And it can shift kind of like the way the stress is applied to the body in a way that like I like. So I use no contact lifts a lot. They have their limitations. Have someone who uses them a lot now, and her like explosion phase, or when she gets the bar around her hip, it's kind of like muted. It's a little soft. So we're just putting in some like no feet powers, things to kind of speed up uh, when the bar makes contact, how she transitions underneath. But like exploring that menu of exercises that you talked about and having something that's like extensively built out, I think that's like a really long-term way of thinking about training and thinking about coaching. And not that you won't use all the same exercise, like you're going to go back to the classics, right? You're going to go back to French
Yeah.
toast and pancakes for breakfast. But like having different iterations of that, maybe like deep fry the batter, right? Maybe you glaze it with something. Maybe you have different toppings, you have different fillings. That's where like the beauty of coaching is. And if you can take that like Mike Teixeira experiment, minimize noise, but like have this like really strange configuration of training, that's when it's fun. And that's when you want to write
Totally.
programs. And that's what I found over time as a coach is understanding exercise selection as like this broad encompassing aspect of training keeps it really interesting and fun and engaging so that I don't want to just write a stock template and just hand that out. But I can think like I can do a better job if I can master this aspect, which is what you're going to talk about at Coaches Only.
Yeah. I mean, all of this stuff. And last little pro tip is keep that menu. Like literally have a sheet or whatever it is of options that either, no matter what your mental model is, you organize it, categorize it how you want. Like these are technique fixes for staying over the bar, and you have a bunch of exercise variations for that. Or these are just like, or just snatch variations, and you have a whole list of all the things that you've done. Because like, how many times have you like forgotten about a variation that you used to use in the past? You're like, oh, I really liked that. Like we used to do that all the time. I don't know why. Like I literally just stopped doing that. Like no contact snatches or whatever. You're like, oh, we used to do that all the time. We go, and then you get reminded of it. You're like, oh shit. And then everybody on your program gets no contact snatches that Monday, you know, but keep it, literally have like an exercise library. A lot of coaches already have this, and I think it's a good idea, but um, I have a sheet, you know, and I'm like, all right, I want to work on snatching. This is what I want to work on. What are some things? And I'll like brainstorm it in my mind, but then I'll pull up my sheet and I'll be like, oh yeah, that. that would be a good one. Pulling from a deficit, using our legs off the floor. I'm like thinking, oh yeah, like hadn't even thought of that, because it's like, I don't know, just didn't cross my mind. So like put that in. So work, we're talking about complexity. Work smart and have things that are like that will clear your mind, and something like that is just a really easy thing to do. And the other thing to do that'll help clear your mind is to have a short conversation with the athlete and to say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. This is what the program might look like this. What do you think? And most athletes don't give a shit, and they're just like, they'll just do what you say, and they're like, yeah, that sounds good. But what that does is it takes away the self conscious feeling that a lot of coaches have, that we need to like please the athlete with the program, or like we don't actually know if the athlete's enjoying this, or like what they expect, and we're like writing the program based on what they think they want. And we don't do things like repeating workouts or lots of variation because we think the athlete won't like it, but we also don't know. So if you just like have a 2-minute conversation about what you're thinking and why, they will give you they will either, you'll get the green light and you won't have to worry about feeling that way, or they'll be like, well, yeah, but can we do this a little bit too? Can we do a little bit more of this? Or I'm feeling that. And like, say, sure. Like that's easy. That's in the menu, And so that is freeing as well. It lifts the like the unwritten, like implicit expectations that you've kind of made up in your head as a coach, that that you think the athlete is looking for a certain type of program, or is or isn't enjoying the process, when you haven't even really talked to them about it.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I would say, just to kind of round this out, is you mentioned having like a list of exercises, and one thing I've kind of found, and I guess come to terms with in grad school, is that you can have your own process, and that's fine. And there's no like perfect process. And I think we kind of become enamored about this idea of like, I need someone else to give me their process or their system. And if I can do that, I have something that's closer to best. In reality, what I found, and listening to coaches and talking to coaches and having my own experience, is that the system you develop is developed around your idiosyncrasies, your
Yeah.
quirks, your preferences, your tendencies. So, having this like sense of shame because you're not doing it a certain way, I don't think that's necessarily correct. I think it's this idea of what works for you, what can you do repeatedly over time, what can you iterate on. If you can do that, you can have a great system. And your ability to then pick up patterns, your ability to then construct like programs that are unique and applied to individuals, right? Like that's the thing that matters. And if you're having success, like by definition, you're doing a good job. So I think all of this really
Totally.
comes down to it's complex. There are a lot of options. There aren't correct options or perfect options. They're just like better and worse options maybe for a situation based on past experience and based on preference. And if you have a system that you can consistently apply changes to or track changes within, you've kind of got it. And then you can get like ideas from coaches. You can generate novel ideas. You can play around with changing a system, but I think just like jumping system to system or jumping like
It's
process to
tough.
process, that's really limiting.
Well, because you're just memorizing methods.
Right.
You're not. There's going to be underlying principles across all of these models. Like everything that we talk about, like with the clinical athlete education side, is like where I introduce models of training as examples of what's out there, and then I try to tie. I'll say, yeah, but all of these models say this, and it's like progressive loading, specificity versus dynamic correspondence, auto regulation. So there's all these like underlying principles, maximizing impulse, these types of things. It's like, okay, yeah, this is Vermeil's hierarchy of performance, and this is, whatever model of strength or whatever it is over here, but they're all governed by the same underlying principles. I want you to be exposed to these models as examples as starting points. Then I want you to create your own mental model, exactly what you just said. create your own process, your own mental model. Then you can take bits and pieces of different methods. Like I said, I mentioned emerging strategies from Mike T, but I don't do it exactly like he does all the time. But the underlying construct has been useful in certain contexts, and the principle of signal to noise, repeating microcycles to manage the variability of readiness, like those types of things have been helpful. But I also have it sometimes looks very traditional, going from like high volume to low volume and to peaking into a meet. So take these methods, just like you said, create your own mental model and be okay with that. And it's also why not every athlete jives with every coach, because exactly what you just said, we can't, our programs are going to be based on our own biases and what we jive with. And if we're athletes, if we were lifters and we responded to certain things, our programs are going to be influenced by that. Like you mentioned Norick and the no contact snatches. Well, like watch them lift, and his father, in an era where contact was lessened, and so it's like that's going to influence the way that you program and the way that you drive exercise selection too. And it's not bad. It's just the way it is. We're humans. So not every athlete's going to jive with your programs either. And if you lose somebody or gain somebody, you're going to gain somebody because of that. You're going to lose somebody because of that over time. And that's just kind of the way it is with that as well. It's not because you're a bad coach or you picked the wrong exercise.
No,
you like, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think the great point that ultimately can be made is that if you adopt someone else's system, that also assumes it's in stasis, right? It's like there's a static quality to it. Mike T is always refining his system. So like just like
Always.
you can't, just like you can't pin down anything and give an exact prediction, you can't pin down any system because they're constantly evolving. So if you go back and you were to say like I want to run this system, it's like saying I want to train the most specific way possible. It's like, okay, you're just going to compete every workout. It's like go to a comp every workout. So you're going to compete once, you're going to train once a week because you're going to be competing once a week. And even then competitions are different. The Arnold's going to be completely different from a local meet where it's one person in a weight class.
Totally.
Because you have M sessions within a weight class. So that already confounds things. So you can never pin down exactly what something is. You can get close approximations. Trying to adopt someone's system, like saying I'm going to do the Glenn Pendlay method, is like you can't do emerging strategies. You can do approximations, you can do your best guess. Even then, you have blind spots. The person doing it has blind spots, and just like saying I'm going to trust the science. It's like science is ever evolving, exploring what isn't known, and in like better and worse ways. But you can't pin it down as one thing. So you just have to do your best, figure out what works, and then like the whole system thing or process thing, it's like figure out what you just have a hard time doing and don't try to do it. Don't force yourself to do it. It's like if you can't think in certain ways, you don't think in mathematical ways, you think more abstractly. It's just like lean into that. If you'd rather have things that are like drop down versus type in versus whatever, it's like do that. I mean, there's no perfect way. It's just a better or worse way for you. So Quinn, great as always, just fantastic. I love the way you think, especially about training and rehab. And I tell people all the time when they ask, like, whenever something about rehab comes up or physio comes up, I always say, guys like Quinn, that's like those are the people I trust. And then I'd always direct them toward clinical athlete or the barbell medicine guys or whoever it is, because that just like resonates so strongly with me in the way that I think. And if people listening are like, resonates with me too as a clinician or as a coach or as an athlete, where can we direct them?
Yeah, I can be found on the Instagrams, the social medias, Quinn.Henoch DPT, clinical athletes. Also follow our page there on Instagram, clinicalathlete.com. I think when this comes out, or pretty close to after, we'll be launching a new website and kind of our our new mentorship program for clinicians looking to become superstars in their exercise prescription and systems thinking skills and managing of complex systems. Pretty much exactly everything that we talked about, just more broadly, just not in the weightlifting realm, but just these principles in their clinical practice. So yeah, be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, and if people are interested in hearing Quinn talk more, I'll give you his phone number after this. I'm kidding.
There it is.
Not going to do that. But you can go to Coaches Only. There'll be a link in the description. You can go to weightliftinghouse.com. You can also use the code PhilWL, that's PHILWL, for 10% off that or any other purchase at weightliftinghouse.com. The same with onyxstraps.com and earthfedmuscle.com. If you are interested in mentorship opportunities in the coaching realm, click the link in the description for Coach Logic. It's a platform that Max, Ada, and I are working on to provide a similar service as Quinn, to provide you with knowledge and broad-reaching information that can be applied in specific ways. I'm on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. And until next time, thanks again for listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.